Mr. Lazar, let me begin with you. Before I go into some of the details of the several documents that we at NewsX have read over the past couple of months, before we get into that, I would just like to understand from you, you lost your entire family in that tragedy.
Yes, I did.
Would you want the Canadian government, sir, to reopen the case?
Ma'am, first of all, before I start, I'd like to make two corrections. A, I lost my entire family, my father, my mother, and my baby sister. Number two, there were 329 people that passed away and not 285 who were bombed. It was 331.
Right. So, my apologies for that. Yes, you're right. All I meant was 268 Canadian citizens, because the Canadian government does not even want to acknowledge that.
Let's come to the point that you asked about reopening the inquiry. Ma'am, I was one of those people that I was a kid when this happened, and I lobbied very fiercely along with other families, victims' families, for up to 20 years. I attended the criminal trial in Vancouver. I sat not more than 15 feet from Bagri and Malik during the trial. I watched them smirk at us. I watched them being found innocent or not guilty of the crimes, though there was insurmountable evidence against them. It broke our hearts. We then lobbied and we got the Justice John Major Commission appointed through Stephen Harper, who was then the Prime Minister of Canada. What is more important, ma'am, is the months before that. The Indian High Commission and the Indian External Affairs Ministry had sent no less than 30 aid memoirs. Ma'am, I don't know if you know what an aid memoir is. The ambassador is here. He will educate us. I've spoken to consular officials. I've spoken to in the course of my research for my book, and warnings from the Indian government that there was going to be an attack on a significant Indian resource, which would either be Air India, State Bank of India, or the consular officials. I have spoken to Mr. Fabian, who was himself a consular official at the time in Canada and was personally attacked by them. Not once, 2 or 3 times. The Prime Minister of Canada has written an apology. All this was before the attack. I will go further to tell you that the FBI and the Secret Service came into Toronto and to Vancouver when Mr. Gandhi, Prime Minister Gandhi, was visiting the United States, about to make sure there was no Khalistani threat to his life. And that was in June of 1985, 20 days before my family got killed in that bombing. So first of all, let's be very, very clear. There was colossal neglect by that government. Our country, our government, our people tried to, warn everybody, and even the Americans did at that stage. No one did anything. The bombing took place. We struggled for 20 years to get that inquiry. If you go through the inquiry, ma'am, the first thing is the criminal investigation. The judgment was because the tapes were wiped clean. They had surveillance on Talvinder Parmar, they had surveillance on Rayat, they had surveillance on Bagri. They had tape recorded conversations of these guys. Not for 1 day or 2 days, 168 hours of tape was wiped clean by Canadian intelligence forces. That is why the transcripts were there, but we can't use transcripts to convict in a court of law. So that was one part. Who's going to answer to that? You will reopen a John Major inquiry? Yes, go. Justice John Major has done a fantastic job. I was one of them that testified. I had individual independent standing, which was paid for by the government and of Canada. I flew there. I spent a long time there, and the report was satisfactory in many regards. But has Canada acted on it? No. Look at it. Look at the situation today. What are we seeing? Look at Prime Minister Trudeau. What our External Affairs Minister is saying is bang on, is absolutely right. And I absolutely support everything that our government has done. If our diplomats cannot be safe in that country, how can our citizens be safe in that country? How can our students be safe in that country? I have young kids who are also studying. I dread to think if they had to go through this. And let me make this very clear at the start of the program. These are not Sikhs. The Sikhs are a wonderful race, and they're the most successful body of people in the country, in India. And these are terrorists. These are radicals. Yes, of course, we'd like it reopened. Thank you.
Mr. Lazar, just before I bring in the other panelists as well, you said that, of course, you were a part of the entire trial that took place in Canada. If you can just shed some more light on that for our viewers, since you have first-hand experience of how the Canadian government, first, of course, as you've pointed out very correctly, in the Justice John Major report, in volume 2, which we've read very carefully here at NewsX as well, there is a series of incidents that lead up to the bombing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Intel report after Intel report given to the Canadian intelligence, given to the Canadian police, and they've just not bothered with anything. Talvinder Parmar comes back to Canada. He's wanted in India. Germany sends him back to Canada, and then they start tracking this man only 8 months after he's been in Canada. Then he's managed to go 20 days before the bomb blast to Duncan in British Columbia. He's conducted a trial blast there, and all of this, all the details are there in the report. They've conducted a trial blast, and the Canadian intelligence officers have written it off as a gunshot.
Gunshot, yes.
So I just like to understand from you, what exactly was happening, sir?
Ma'am, I'd like to compliment you and your channel. I think in all these years, you're probably the first channel that has gone so deep into reading the report. You know, I tell you, there are a number of people who've not even bothered to read it. That's part one. Yes, you're right. There are two parts to this. The first part is the criminal trial. Now, you know, we're Indians, so I'll speak from an Indian standpoint. The judge was Justice Josephson, a Canadian Caucasian, and we're talking about 2005. Now, please remember that 85 to 2005 is 20 years. The RCMP and the others did nothing during that period. They said they were investigating. But there was a lady who came forward. I'm only touching one witness, not the others. And she said she was having a relationship with one of them. And she is on witness protection. And if you read the transcripts, she is known as Mrs. D.
Yes.
Mrs. D says and admits that they confessed to bombing the aircraft. They confessed to buying the tickets. They confessed to meeting XYZ. And the judge says, if he's done so much and she's admitting this on the stand, how can she still say that she loves him and respects him? Now, it's very difficult for a white-skinned person to understand what an Indian ethos is. You know, you hear, you know, families get bound together once and they stay together. If there is a relationship, obviously this lady cared more deeper than that for Mr. Malik at that time. And he couldn't accept that both could be the truth. So he found her a liar. And that's why that witness testimony was wiped out. Had that been on record, these two would have been in jail for life for 331 counts of murder. But they weren't. They walked scot-free. As far as the investigation goes, or the surveillance, this is the pre-bombing surveillance. The pre-bombing surveillance, actually, ma'am, I'll take you 10 months before. Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated on the 31st of October.
Yes.
And there was, of course, the tragic Sikh pogrom, which should never have happened. You know, it's devastating to all of us. After that, the Khalistani Commando Force gives a statement that they're going to blow up or attack an Indian aircraft. Very few people realize in the middle of November of 1984, an Air India aircraft was hijacked and it traveled to Maldives with 2 Sikh separatists on board. Khalistani, let me use the correct word, they were Khalistani separatists. And it travels to Maldives and then they refuel and go to Seychelles. And that is the time it was part of Talvinder Parmar's setup. They surrender and they were found guilty in Delhi in the courts, and they died in jail actually. But that should have sent warning bells to the whole world that this is what these people are about to do. They started tracking these guys in December of 1984 in Vancouver, British Columbia. They tracked them to Duncan, you're right. They tracked their recordings. They tracked them to a meet of the World Sikh Organization, which was one of their groups in California, as well as in New York, a little before Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was to come. They have recordings in the US of people saying that, we don't care how many go down, but we're going to take these people down so that the Indian government will come down on their knees. Now, these are not light statements,
Yes.
They've got recordings, they've got photographs of of all the officers. The officers have photographs of both the RCMP and the CSIS surveilling all the three guys' houses. And yet, and all these photographs are available on the net even today. And yet, not one of them raises alarm bells. They keep sending the recordings to the head office. The head office listens to it, gets it translated, because a lot of the conversation, I think, was in Punjabi. And they just write it down and they let it go and they burn the tapes. They put it in an incinerator and take it out, where it just gets flash burnt. Now, none of this was being relayed, or it was being relayed and no one was concerned. There was also a very vicious rumor at the time that there was a mole. And that's why nobody, the Canadians had a mole in that setup, and that's why they didn't want it out. But be that as it may, it's reached this stage and you couldn't convict them in a criminal trial. There is double jeopardy, of course. As we all know, you can't try the same people for the same crime a second time.
Yes.
In any system, in any country also. You had the John Major inquiry. You had a report, lessons learned from Bob Ray, who was also the Premier of Ontario. Ma'am, even today, they are not even adhering. There is terrorist funding going on. These guys are trying to take over gurdwaras. They are threatening people. And there is actually mayhem in some parts of Canada, in BC. Canada has become a soft state. Simple. That's all, I would do.
Okay.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.